I've always wanted to do one of these. Okay, here we go. The following video contains strong language. Viewer discretion is advised. Still here? Well, let's get it on.
Get in the Ferrari, slide over here and show me things you would do for the subject. Girl, I wanna watch it. A house in the hills, you can tell your friends you're making it in Hollywood. You can tell.
I'm Brian Hill, and once again we are talking about writing. This video is going to be about my upcoming Vertigo DC series, American Carnage. Some of you might be familiar with it, those who follow me on Twitter. Some of you might not be familiar with it. It comes out in November, I believe, and you can contact your local comic retailer about it. I'm not really pitching the story to you here. I'm really just kind of going into the origins of it, why I wrote it, and what it means for me, and why I might think it's interesting for readers out there. So the basic pitch is a pretty simple one to American Carnage. It's about a half-black former FBI agent who's been disgraced for reasons I won't spoil now. And he is asked by a friend who's still in the FBI to investigate the murder of an FBI agent. And the FBI believes that the agent was murdered by a white supremacist organization in California, Southern California, to be exact. So that's the pitch. That's the concept. It doesn't seem to reinvent the wheel, does it? But I believe the way I execute the story is very different. Most of these stories, they happen in the past. You'll see them in the 20s and the 30s. I think Black Klansman was the 70s. Well, this happens in the modern day. And it's based on the personal research that I've done, on my own experience. And it's also set in a blue state. It's set in the blue state of California. I think a lot of these stories, they tend to characterize the South or the Midwest. We tend to regionalize these kinds of movements and belief systems into the red. But they exist in the blue as well. And, these ideas exist across the political spectrum. It's not exclusively a right-wing idea, the idea of, ethnic supremacy. You'll see it manifested on the left as well in different ways, on ways that aren't really obvious. And that's what this story, I think, explores, among many, many other things. And I think a common question might be, Brian, why on earth would you write this now? Of all things to write, why would you write this? Well, one, I did not predict that culture was going to kind of peak where it is right now, especially comics culture, when I started working on the project. Mark Doyle and Andy Corey over at Vertigo, who are friends of mine, they contacted me and asked me, Jamie Rich as well, over there, asked me if I had anything for the Vertigo 25th anniversary. And I thought to myself, well, gosh, I don't really have like magical realism, the sort of Neil Gaiman type of storytelling that is often associated with Vertigo, but I did have this story I was working on that would eventually become American Carnage. And I told them, well, I have a crime story. And I didn't know what it was going to be. I had a bunch of notes, and I'd been talking to people and compiling my thoughts, because I often do that. I do a lot of research before I know what the form of the research is going to be. And I told them, well, there's a crime story I have. It'll be pretty controversial. It's going to make people a little sanguine, I think, on both sides of the political spectrum, but I'm happy to share it, and then you can tell me no, and then we can try to find something else about, like, a werewolf who's a sorcerer or something, and he travels in between dimensions when he, snorts cocaine. And they read the pitch, and they liked it, and they wanted me to go forward with it. And I had my reservations, because I know how tribal things can be out there when something seems to touch base with politics. And I didn't want to make things worse with a book. I wanted to, create a conversation, I guess, but more importantly, make a crime thriller that was intense in a world that we haven't seen depicted this way before, where there's characters instead of caricatures, and it's not preaching from any side, but it's presenting things as honest as I can. So for those out there who are, rolling their eyes because this is yet another political thing, so on and so forth, it's not really that. I mean, it is set in a world where you are going to see political ideas because that is authentic to the world. But it's not a diatribe. It's not me on a soapbox telling you how to feel, telling you how to think. I don't think that's particularly interesting in fiction. If I wanted to do that, I'd write a nonfiction book that was argumentative, by intention. This is a story, and I tried to make it as real as I could and invest as much as I could into it and let people engage with these characters in this world on their own terms. I mean, more so than white supremacy, the story is really about manipulation and the way people can wield our low self-esteem against us. The way that our fears can be used to gather us and point us in directions, so much so that we forget what we have in common. And we start protecting things, thinking that other people are going to take them. And you have a character in the middle of this who is half black, half white, doesn't really identify with either quote-unquote side, as it were, on the census form. And so Richard, our main character, is also dealing with these concepts of identity. And as he burrows into this movement, he becomes very close to the leader of the faction that he's approaching, a man named Wynne Allen Morgan. And Wynne Morgan is incredibly charismatic. He's one of those people that can use you against you. So the story is really a battle of wills between these two people. It's sort of Richard figuring out how he's going to get next to this man who may or may not be guilty, right? We leave that question open. And who really deserves punishment in this scenario? And is the FBI justified in doing what they're doing against a private citizen? We raise all of those questions. So I would think about this more like a crime drama than a political text. At least that's how I view it. It's going to have some stark language and stark moments. It's got violence. Those things are certainly present. But don't expect something that reads like a Medium article, because that's not my intention. I'm thinking more about works like Scalped and 100 Bullets, things that project a world onto the page, but don't smother you in a point of view. So those are the creative intentions that I have with American Carnage. Leandro Fernandez is doing the art. It's brilliant. Dean White's doing the colors. They're excellent. I would show you more of the book here, but I don't want to spoil everything because the first issue has a lot of plot in it. A lot of things happen that are impactful, so I don't want to show those images here. And the stills that you're seeing are from some of the influences of the book. There's a lot of influences, but here I picked True Detective Season 1, which I think is brilliant. A lot of people, regard it as such. But also Narc, a movie by Joe Carnahan. I believe he wrote it as well. I think he wrote it and directed it. Narc is one of my favorite films. I think it's a remarkable movie. Ray Liotta gives one of his best performances in it. Jason Patric has never been better. Carnahan's direction is both organic and assured. So I would go check that out. So that's kind of the elevator of American Carnage. And then I thought I would share a couple personal stories about how this came to be. So let's go back to me being a kid, probably like 9 years old. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and my mother is driving this Buick Skylark that we had. It was an old, 70s car. It was huge, gorgeous, kind of painted brown, a boat of a car, but very sturdy and secure as those old cars from the 70s were. This is probably in, 87, maybe 86, I think. So we'd had the car for a while. And we were on the highway, and my mother was driving. I think she was taking me home from school, and the car began to stall. And she struggled to pull it to the shoulder of the road, because it was a little hard, when the car kind of slowed down, and she couldn't get it over, and tried to get it over, and there was a big rig behind us that kept honking and honking and honking, but we couldn't get the car over. We had to kind of wrestle with it. She had to wrestle with it. I was a kid. I didn't do anything. I was white-knuckling the whole time. But she had to wrestle with it, and she got the car to the shoulder of the road. And I think the big rig had to brake or do something evasive because of what happened with my mother's car. And as the driver was passing by, he called us niggers. He just pointed at us and said something niggers, and just kept driving. Now, I'm like 9 years old, so I've never really heard that word before. So I didn't have an emotional reaction to it because I didn't know what it was. But I looked over, and my mother, her hands were shaking. She was very upset. I mean, part of it was getting the car to the shoulder. The other part of it was kind of going through that because she had lived through a generation where that was far more common than it is today. Even though we have our problems today, it's nothing compared to what my mother and, my grandmother had to go through, obviously. And she was very, very upset. I'd never seen my mother that upset before. She's a very strong woman, as you have to be, I think, if, you're raising a son, especially if you're raising a son alone, because my father had died at this point. And so I asked her what was wrong, and she said that the man had called us a word that's an ugly word that no one should ever call you. And that was it. That's all she said. I didn't want to ask any more because it's pretty disturbing to see your parents upset. Your parents tend to be consistent, and she was very, very upset, and I just kind of wanted the moment to end. So I never really sort of forgot that, And then time went on, I learned what it meant and the whole thing. I could put it in emotional context. But that was probably my first personal experience with, directed hatred because of what I was. And I'm not lambasting people who drive big rigs. My uncle drove a big rig. I'm not saying that everybody, is bad. This is an individual who made a choice, and I regard him as an individual who made a choice. So that memory stayed alive with me. Memory stays alive with me in general. I have a very close connection to the past because I'm always thinking about it, because I'm usually writing about it. And I had filed that away and didn't know how to address it. Sometimes you need to get something out so it doesn't live inside of you anymore. You just don't want to be in Crime Alley thinking about the pearls falling in slow motion anymore. You got to put it somewhere so you can get rid of it. So then we're going to flash back. We'll flash forward in a flashback to me, I guess it was right after college. And I had gone back home to St. Louis to kind of find my way. And there was a kid I grew up with, a white kid, who was a really good friend of mine when I was real young, talking 10, 11, maybe earlier than that, maybe 8, whatever. And, he came over to the house a lot. We hung out a lot. I knew his family. We broke bread together, as it were. And we lost touch a little bit as I went into high school, and then we didn't really keep up anymore. But there were a couple years where, this guy was my best friend. He was family to me. I thought of him like a brother, like you think about any brother. And I came back to St. Louis after college, and randomly I bumped into him outside of a video store. This is back when they still had video stores. And he was all skinhead out. Now, he had the shaved head, he had the boots and the whole thing. He was, walking around with guys that had lightning bolts and the whole deal. And I made eye contact with him, not because I was trying to eyeball him, because I didn't want a confrontation. I just couldn't believe it was him. And so he looked at me, and I looked at him, and time kind of stopped. And I think in silence, we decided this wasn't the best place to have this conversation. Whatever conversation we may have, we probably shouldn't have it here. So, I went my ways, and him and his friends, they went their way. I think they were a little curious about what that moment was, but, we just didn't keep that going. We kind of split up and went back to our worlds. And then I contacted his family, and I said, well, hey, I saw so-and-so. I'm not going to bring his name up here. I saw so-and-so. And I just want to know if he's willing to sit down and have a conversation with me. I just don't understand how the kid that I loved had become what he became. And his mother made some arrangements and said, yeah, and so we hopped on the phone just really briefly to set up a place to meet. And we wound up meeting in the south side of St. Louis, which is a wider section of the city. I lived more central, which is more integrated, but the south side is a little more white, and he would feel more comfortable there because of, kind of his aesthetics, as it were. And I was fine to go over there and speak with him. And so we sat down, in like a remote little bar somewhere. I think it was around 21, and he'd be about the same. And we just had a conversation. And I didn't accuse him of anything. I wasn't trying to confront him. I don't think any of that's particularly useful. I just wanted to know what had changed between the past and the present. And he'd gone through a lot of stuff. There's been economic problems in his family. This is when the economy post 9/11 was causing some problems, and that was a thing. And then, he had a brother, and the brother had gotten hooked on some drugs and had gone through a situation. And then he committed a petty crime, and that made him a bit of a pariah, and he couldn't really find work. And he found some work doing labor with a guy who introduced him to these other guys, and you could see that he found a kind of identity through that someone had accepted him despite his flaws and then despite his imperfections, and they had given him a reason why he suffered and the people he loved suffered. And that reason was that people like me were getting too much advantage in the world, and they were taking from people like him. And so it wasn't a long conversation. I listened more than I spoke, and then I got up and left, and I haven't spoken with him since. I mean, I hope he's okay. I haven't spoken with him since. But I'd never been through an experience where I felt like I'd lost someone that wasn't dead, but I felt like he was gone. And I still have photographs of he and I together that mean very much to me. And I don't know, you kind of feel like, well, maybe I could have, God, if I kept up with him or something, or if I had, just had a relationship with him, maybe that didn't have to happen, but, it is what it is, and that's life. And so that became a memory that was living inside of me as well, that I had to kind of wrestle with and exercise into some work. And then the Dylan Roof event happened. And my grandmother had told me stories about violence, about lynchings, that kind of thing, because she had grown up in that age where that would happen. And my mother had told me stories about the civil rights movement, and the barking dogs and the hoses and the beatings and all of that. And I guess naively, I thought that was far away for some reason. You'd hear about events like Jasper and the rest of it, and you feel like they're outliers, but it wasn't just the tragedy, the crime that Dylan Roof committed. It was the aftermath around it. It seemed like the beginning of a thing, or the returning of a thing. And I felt something that I haven't felt in a long time. I felt fear. And I try not to let my fear live and breathe. I spend a lot of effort to overcome fear, to confront fear, to go into the dark places, shine the light, to stop the dragon from being a dragon, and confront it so it doesn't just live in your subconscious mind. So I decided I would try to do some research, like in, the modern day, what would compel someone to want to kill me without knowing me simply because of my ethnicity? Like, why? How? And I went to some message boards under a pseudonym and just absorbed some conversations there. And then I reached out to friends who were involved in kind of civil rights issues, social work, whatever, to see if there was a way I could talk to someone kind of vibrant in the movement. And set up some of those things. It was probably dumb to do, but I did it. I'm not going to tell you what boards I went to or the people I talked to, because I'm not trying to draw attention to any of this stuff. But, it's out there. It's not hard to find it. And I did have some in-person meetings. I had some phone calls first, and then some in-person meetings. If you do that sort of thing, I suggest that you use a burner phone. Don't use an actual cell phone that has value to you, because you never know who's going to get that number. I didn't go online from my home. I would go from coffee shops and use a a different kind of Wi-Fi port, so it wasn't always leading back to where I lived, things like that. I tried to take precautions, and I have friends in law enforcement, and they were also helpful. I had a couple off-duty police officers that would be in the area for me. I just kind of asked them for a favor when I would meet with people. And I met with people in St. Louis, and I met with a couple people here on the West Coast. And I tried to absorb kind of what it was all about, let them talk to me in their own words. And it was a harrowing experience, but it was a necessary experience for me because the media was working overtime to terrify all of us. And I wanted to put actual experience where that fear was. And so when I had these conversations and I was sitting there listening, some people were just rude the entire time, which is what you expect. I mean, I've talked to intense people a lot, over my life because of my work. So that I was pretty used to. And some people would fire off some niggers at you, some porch monkeys, just to kind of see if they could get you to react. And it's very difficult to get me to react. I have a saying that you can have, what do I say? I say you can get me to dismiss you for free, but my anger you have to earn. And it just wasn't. I wasn't going to get angry about it. But a couple of times after the first kind of moments of 100% mistrust, am I setting them up for something? And, am I laying traps? All of that. Once we got through all of that, and they realized that they couldn't provoke me with a slur or the 14 words, which I won't say here on this video. If you're interested in what the 14 words are, just type them into Google, get the 14 words, and you'll see them. You might see them in the book. After they realized that it wasn't going to be this stunty, conversation based on provocation, people would just start settling into what human beings do, which is trying to relate to the human being across from you. And not that it was like a full, lowering the armor. No, drawbridges weren't lowered, but people would speak honestly. And I saw that there were factions and divisions, that there was a system within the system, and a lot of it just had to do with a sense of belonging, of purpose, trying to find pride in something. And these were all things that I could recognize within myself as well. And I try to impart that. I tried to say, okay, well, the emotions you feel are universal. You're not the only person going through that. Other people are going through that. I go through that. I know people that go through that. And I'm not going to say that I reached anybody, because I wasn't really trying to reach anyone. I was just trying to absorb details. But from that experience, I got what I believed was enough information, emotional and intellectual, so I could sit down and I could write this story. And that's the manna that American Carnage was forged from. That's the coal that I've tried to squeeze and turn into a jewel. If not a diamond, then at least make it harder and more compact than it was when I began. And it's born from kind of a collection of those experiences. And I hope that people who read the book can read it with an open mind, without an expectation one way or another, and absorb the story. They will probably disagree with events that happen in there. They will certainly disagree with the words I'm using on occasion, with the ideas presented within it. But I have a lot of faith in people being able to make up their own mind and come to a work in their own way. I don't believe that I ever need to preach to people. I had someone on Twitter accuse me of this being an anti-white project, and my response to that is, if you think a book that explores white supremacist movements is anti-white, then you likely have a very low opinion of white people. Because I don't think the characters in the book are symbols of anything. They are individuals who have made choices. They are not emblematic of anything. Richard is not a paladin. He is not a perfect character. He's a character with many flaws. Sheila, the FBI agent that is pushing Richard into this mission, is a character with a lot of flaws. And Win Morgan is a character who has flaws, but he also has some virtues, and that's what makes him so dangerous. is there is a sense of reason to him and an ambition you can understand, and a kind of selective compassion that I hope is pretty terrifying, because selective compassion is terrifying. So yeah, that's kind of my introduction, I suppose, to American Carnage as a work. If you've been listening to me, bang on this long, I appreciate that. Check out True Detective Season 1 if you haven't. Also, make sure that you check out Narc by Joe Carnahan. It's one of my favorite films. I highly recommend it. If you watch it, find me on Twitter, at Brian Edward Hill, and let me know what you think. The next video that's going to be up on Monday will be about story structure, about 3-act story structure, 5-act story structure, and how they're both the same thing. I won't be discussing my work in specifics. I'll be discussing just kind of narrative in general. I'll probably use Star Wars again, because that's the monomyth. But we'll see. Until then, be kind to each other. I know that the temperature is rising, especially in comics, but try not to injure. Remember that we can disagree without destroying each other. It's possible. And you can disagree with me and find me online and talk to me about your perspective. And I'm certainly willing to do that, but try to be kind to each other and don't let anyone on any side of an issue pull you towards your baser nature. Remain independent of the ambition and the motivation of people, and focus on what you want to accomplish in the world, the good that you can do on your own terms. Okay, well, until next time, keep working, keep writing, take care.